Linda told me I had 7 days to tear down my fence or lose my home. She thought she was using the law to destroy me. She had no idea that I found a mistake in the original 1974 city survey that proves her entire house shouldn't even exist. I'm not just keeping my fence. I'm about to make the HOA president homeless. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what happens when she opens the file. In the zip code of Oakwood Estates, perfection isn't a choice, it's an obsession. For 15 years, I've been a quiet resident on this corner lot. I've watched the seasons paint the maples red, raised a family, and built a life that felt solid. Part of that life was my Redwood fence, a handcrafted, custom-stained boundary that I spent 3 summers perfecting. To me, it was a work of art. To the new HOA president, it was a target. Peace in a neighborhood like this is a fragile thing. It only takes one person with a badge and a power complex to turn your sanctuary into a courtroom. That person was Linda. Linda moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago, and within 90 days, she had staged what I can only call a bureaucratic coup. She didn't just join the HOA board, she replaced it. She promised the older resident standardization and increased property values, but what she actually delivered was a reign of terror. She started with the easy targets, fining people for leaving their trash cans out 10 minutes too long or for having the wrong shade of mulch. But Linda was a predator who wanted to prove her absolute authority. She chose me as her masterpiece. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. I was in my front yard, kneeling in the dirt, tending to the hydrangeas my late wife had planted. They were her pride and joy, and keeping them blooming was my way of keeping her memory alive. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of expensive heels on the asphalt before I saw the shadow. "Mr. Henderson," she barked. Her voice was like a frozen razor blade. I stood up slowly, brushing the soil from my knees. "Good morning, Linda." She didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge the greeting. She was staring at my redwood fence with a look of pure, calculated disgust. She tapped her digital tablet with a manicured finger. "I've been conducting a comprehensive neighborhood audit, Mr. Henderson. According to the newly ratified Section 4.2 of the Oakwood Covenant, your side yard structure is exactly 3¼ inches over the maximum allowed height." I looked at the fence, then back at her. "Linda, this fence has been here for 12 years. It was approved by the original board. I have the signed permits in my safe." She let out a dry, hollow laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "The founding board was a collection of sentimental amateurs. I'm the president now, and I've re-indexed every property to meet modern architectural standards. Your fence is a visual safety hazard and creates aesthetic friction in the new master plan. Furthermore, the stain, autumn sienna, has been removed from the approved palette. We only allow slate gray or classic white now." I felt a heat rising in my chest that I hadn't felt in decades. "You want me to destroy a $10,000 custom fence because of 3 inches and a shade of brown?" "I don't want you to, Mr. Henderson. I am ordering you to," she said, stepping closer until I could smell her expensive perfume. She pulled a neon yellow envelope from her clipboard, the notice of violation. Instead of handing it to me, she jammed it into a gap in the redwood planks. "You have 7 days to bring this structure into compliance. If it's still standing next Wednesday, the HOA will impose a $500 daily fine." And per the new bylaws I passed last month, once those fines hit $5,000, we begin foreclosure proceedings on this house. She turned on her heel and walked away without another word. She thought she had won. She saw an old man with a garden trowel and assumed I was a pushover who would crumble under the threat of a legal bill. She thought I would spend my retirement savings trying to fight her in a system she had already rigged. What Linda didn't realize was that I wasn't just a gardener. Before I retired, I spent 30 years as a senior clerk in the county's land records and surveying office. I knew where every pipe was buried, where every boundary was drawn, and more importantly, I knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. That night, I went into my basement and opened my father's old surveying trunk. He had been the lead surveyor for this entire county back in 1974, long before Oakwood Estates was even a blueprint in a developer's mind. I spent 8 hours under a dim lamp, comparing the original county land grant maps with the modern HOA boundaries Linda was so proud of. And that's when I found it, a massive, catastrophic clerical error that had been overlooked for 50 years. Linda was so obsessed with my fence being 3 inches too high that she never bothered to check the actual land coordinates of her own property. According to the 1974 federal survey, the land her house was built on wasn't even part of the Oakwood Estates plot. It was designated as public utility easement. In simple terms, Linda didn't own her land, the city did, and her house was technically an illegal structure. I didn't get angry, I didn't call my lawyer, I just sat at my desk, grabbed a thick manila folder and began to assemble the file. Linda wanted a war over 3 inches of wood. Fine. I was going to give her a war over her entire life. I left that folder on her doorstep the next morning. It was the last thing she would ever open as president. The night I spent in my basement wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by precision. You see, when you've spent 30 years as a county land records clerk, you learn that the world isn't built on bricks and mortar. It's built on paper. Every house, every street, and every HOA boundary exists only because a surveyor once drew a line and a clerk filed it away. And sometimes those clerks make mistakes. Huge, life-altering mistakes. Linda thought she was the master of the Oakwood Covenant, but she was playing a game on a map that was fundamentally broken. By 3:00 a.m., I had everything I needed. The 1974 Federal Survey, the original city utility easements, and the specific land grant coordinates for Lot 42, Linda's lot. I tucked the documents into a thick manila folder, sealed it, and wrote one word on the front in bold, black ink: notice. The next morning, the sun rose over Oakwood Estates with a deceptive calm. I walked across the street, the dew still fresh on the grass, and placed the folder directly on Linda's doorstep. I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I just walked back to my porch, sat in my rocking chair with a cup of black coffee, and waited for the explosion. It didn't take long. Around 9:30 a.m., Linda's front door swung open. She was dressed for battle, power suit, heels, and that infamous tablet clutched to her chest. She saw the folder, frowned, and picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. I watched from across the street as she tore it open. At first, her face was a mask of annoyance. She probably thought it was a formal protest or a lawyer's letter she could easily ignore. But then she pulled out the 1974 blueprint. I saw her head tilt. She pulled out the city easement map. Her movements slowed down. Then she reached the final page, the one where I had highlighted the exact coordinates of her front door in neon pink, showing that it sat exactly 12 feet inside a non-build zone owned by the City Department of Water and Power. Even from 50 yards away, I saw the color drain from her face. She looked up at her own house, then back at the paper, then she looked across the street at me. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. But Linda wasn't the type to surrender. Her shock quickly turned into a desperate, vibrating rage. She didn't come to talk. She marched straight to her SUV and sped off, likely heading to the city archives to prove me wrong. She thought I was bluffing. 2 hours later, she was back, but she wasn't alone. A white truck with the city planning and surveying logo followed her into the cul-de-sac. This was exactly what I wanted. Linda had called the professionals to fix my clerical error, thinking they would find a way to justify her position. She wanted to humiliate me publicly. A young surveyor in a neon vest hopped out, holding a professional-grade GPS tripod. Linda was hovering over him, pointing at the ground, her voice shrill and echoing through the neighborhood. "It's a mistake," she was screaming. "The old records are outdated. This lot was cleared for residential use in 2005. The surveyor didn't say much. He just went to work. Neighbors started peeking out of their windows. Mrs. Gable came out onto her porch. The Millers stopped washing their car to watch the drama. The Queen of Oakwood was making a scene, and the whole court was watching. I walked down to the edge of my driveway, leaning against my illegal cedar fence. The surveyor spent 20 minutes taking readings, checking his digital maps and scratching his head. Finally, he looked at his screen, then at the manila folder Linda was shaking in his face, and then at her house. "Ma'am," the surveyor said, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I don't know how to tell you this, but this gentleman's records aren't just accurate. They're the primary legal deeds for this sector." Linda froze. "What does that mean for my violation notice against him?" The surveyor looked at my fence, then back at Linda's house. "It means your fence height doesn't matter, because technically the HOA has no jurisdiction over this corner of the street. But more importantly, it means your entire master suite and garage are built over a high-pressure city water main easement. By law, the city can order this entire structure demolished within 48 hours if they need to access those pipes." The silence that followed was absolute. The clipboard Linda was holding slipped from her hand and clattered onto the pavement. The woman who had spent months threatening to take people's homes because of the shade of their mulch had just been told her own home was a legal ghost. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and realization. She had come for my 3 inches of wood, and in the process, she had exposed the fact that she didn't even own the ground she stood on. I smiled, stepped off my driveway, and walked toward her. "So, Linda," I said softly, "about that 7-day deadline for my fence. Do you still want to discuss the autumn sienna stain, or should we talk about how you're going to explain this to the rest of the board?" In the world of bureaucracy, silence isn't just golden, it's a weapon. After the city surveyor left Linda's driveway in a cloud of dust and legal uncertainty, the neighborhood went quiet. But it wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. Linda had spent the last 48 hours locked in her house, probably burning through her phone battery, calling every lawyer in the tri-state area. But I wasn't waiting for a lawyer. I was waiting for Thursday night. Thursday was the monthly HOA board meeting. Usually these meetings were boring affairs, discussions about pool cleaning schedules and the budget for Christmas lights. But tonight, the community center was packed. Neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years were squeezed into the back rows, whispering. They had all seen the city truck. They had all heard the rumors. I walked in late, carrying the same manila folder. I didn't sit in the back. I walked right to the front row, directly across from Linda. She looked at me, and for the first time in 3 months, she didn't have a snarky comment about my clothes or my property. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking as she shuffled her papers. "The meeting will come to order," Linda snapped, her voice cracking slightly. She tried to proceed with the agenda as if her entire life wasn't hanging by a thread. "First item, architectural violations. Mr. Henderson, you were served a notice regarding your non-compliant fence. The 7-day grace period expires tomorrow. Have you made arrangements for its removal?" The room went dead silent. The audacity of this woman was staggering. Even with the knowledge that her own house was a legal phantom, she was still trying to bully me into submission. It was her last-ditch effort to maintain the illusion of control. I stood up slowly. I didn't look at the other board members. I looked straight at Linda. "I haven't touched a single nail on that fence, Linda, and I don't plan to." "Then you will face the maximum daily fine, followed by foreclosure proceedings," she hissed, her face turning a deep, blotchy red. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Henderson, no matter how long you've lived here." I smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew he was holding a royal flush. "You're absolutely right, Linda. The rules do apply to everyone, especially the rules regarding who is actually eligible to sit on this board." I opened the manila folder and pulled out the 1974 Federal Survey and the city utility easement maps. I walked up to the board table and laid them out in front of the vice president, a retired accountant named Arthur who had always been a fair man. According to the Oakwood Estates covenant, the very one Linda here loves to quote, "Only legal property owners within the defined HOA boundaries are eligible to serve on the board or hold the office of president," I said, my voice projecting to the very back of the room. Linda tried to grab the papers, but Arthur held them down. "What are you talking about, Henderson?" Arthur asked, squinting through his bifocals. "I'm talking about Lot 42, I replied. "Linda's lot. If you look at these city records, you'll see that the 1974 survey clearly defines a high-pressure water main easement that was never properly vacated. When this neighborhood was developed in the 90s, the developer ignored the easement. But legally, that land belongs to the City Department of Water and Power." I paused for effect, letting the weight of the words sink in. This means 2 things. First, Linda's house is an illegal structure built on public land. But second, and more importantly for this meeting, her property is technically excluded from the private HOA plot. She isn't a resident of Oakwood Estates. She is a squatter on city property. A collective gasp went up from the audience. Linda jumped to her feet. "This is a lie. It's a forged document. I have a title. I have a mortgage." "You have a title based on a clerical error, Linda," I countered calmly. "And as a former senior clerk of the Land Records Office, I've already filed a notice of discrepancy with the county. They've frozen your property records. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, you are legally disqualified from holding any office in this community." The other 4 board members looked at each other in shock. Arthur looked at the maps, then at the highlighted coordinates, and finally at Linda. "Linda, is this true? Did the city surveyor confirm this on Tuesday?" Linda didn't answer. She couldn't. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The queen had been stripped of her crown, her scepter, and her kingdom in less than 5 minutes. I move to immediately vacate the position of president, Arthur said, his voice cold. And I move to drop all pending architectural violations until a full audit of the boundary lines is completed. Seconded, shouted 3 other members simultaneously. I leaned over the table, looking Linda right in the eye. It's funny, isn't it? You were so worried about my fence being 3 inches too high. It turns out you should have been worried about your entire house being 12 feet too far to the left. Linda didn't wait for the vote. She grabbed her designer bag, shoved her tablet into it, and practically ran out of the room. The sound of her heels clacking away was the most beautiful music I'd heard in years. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot, because while Linda was out of the HOA, she still had a much bigger problem. The city of Chicago was now aware that a 2-story house was sitting directly on top of their primary water artery. And as I watched her SUV speed out of the parking lot, I knew that her 7-day deadline was about to become my favorite memory. They say justice is a dish best served cold, but in the suburbs of Oakwood Estates, justice was being served with the roar of a diesel engine. By Friday morning, the neighborhood didn't wake up to the sound of chirping birds or the rustle of the wind through the maples. Instead, we woke up to the grinding gears of city machinery and the sight of men in neon vests unrolling massive blueprints across the hood of a truck. The file I had left on Linda's doorstep wasn't just a warning to her, it was a ticking time bomb for the city's legal department. When I filed that notice of discrepancy, I knew exactly what would happen. You see, when a municipality discovers that a private residence is obstructing a critical infrastructure artery, like a high-pressure water main, they don't send a polite letter. They send a crew. I stood on my porch, my hand resting on my illegal redwood fence, watching the scene unfold. Linda's front door flew open so hard it hit the siding of her house. She stumbled out, still in her pajamas, her hair a mess, looking nothing like the polished president who had threatened me just days ago. "What is this?" she screamed, her voice cracking as she ran toward the foreman. "You can't be here, this is private property. I'm the president of the HOA. The foreman, a burly man named Mike who looked like he had seen everything twice, didn't even look up from his tablet. "Ma'am, I don't care if you're the Queen of England. We have a court-ordered emergency access warrant. There's a pressure drop in the main line directly under this lot. If we don't inspect the valve housing immediately, the street and your basement could be under 6 feet of water by nightfall." "There are no pipes under my house," Linda shrieked. "My developer said." "Your developer lied to you, ma'am," Mike interrupted, finally looking at her. "Or they didn't look at the 1974 survey. Either way, this house is sitting on a city easement. We aren't here to ask permission. We're here to dig." The neighbors began to emerge from their homes, forming a silent semicircle on the sidewalk. Mrs. Gable was there, clutching her robe. The Millers were there, filming the whole thing on their phones. The irony was thicker than the humidity in the air. For months, Linda had used rules and regulations as a weapon to terrorize this community. Now, the biggest, most immovable rule of all, the law of land use, was being turned against her. Mike signaled to the operator of the excavator. The machine groaned to life, its metal arm swinging toward Linda's perfectly manicured front lawn, the one she had fined the Miller family for not mowing properly. With one swift motion, the steel bucket bit into the grass, ripping up the sod and the expensive irrigation system she was so proud of. Linda let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She turned and saw me standing on my porch. For a second, our eyes met. There was no more arrogance in her gaze, only desperation. She realized then that I hadn't just defended my fence, I had unraveled the very ground she was standing on. As the crew dug deeper, the situation went from bad to catastrophic for Linda. About 4 feet down, the excavator hit a concrete slab that wasn't on the modern maps. Mike waved his hand for the machine to stop. He hopped into the trench with a flashlight and a brush. "Hey, Bill," Mike yelled to his partner. "Get the inspector on the radio. We've got a major violation here." It turned out that when Linda's house was built, the contractors had poured the foundation footer directly over the protective casing of the water main. It was a structural nightmare. Not only was the house illegal, but it was also structurally compromising the city's infrastructure. The city inspector arrived 30 minutes later in a black sedan. He spent 5 minutes looking into the hole and 10 minutes looking at the paperwork I had provided the night before. He walked over to Linda, who was now sitting on her front steps, defeated. "Ms. Miller," the inspector said, his voice cold and professional, This structure is being declared unsafe for habitation effectively immediately. The foundation is encroaching on a critical utility. We're shutting off your water and power now to prevent a catastrophic rupture." "You're condemning my house," Linda whispered. "We're securing the site," the inspector corrected her. "But until this easement is cleared, you cannot stay here. And I'll be honest, given the location of this main, the only way to clear it might be to remove the encroaching portions of the structure. That means your garage and the master bedroom above it." The Queen had lost her throne, not because of a revolution, but because of 12 feet of missing paperwork and a retired clerk who knew how to read a map. As the power lines to her house were disconnected and the streetlights flickered on, Linda sat in the dark, watching the city crews prepare to tear into her life. I walked down to my mailbox, pulled out the neon yellow violation notice she had stuck in my fence, and dropped it into the trash can. My fence was still standing. Her house, however, was about to become a memory. They say a cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Linda was no exception. After the city crews left her lawn looking like a battlefield and her house was declared unsafe for habitation, she didn't just pack her bags and disappear. Instead, she did what every entitled person in Oakwood Estates does when they lose a fair fight. She hired the most expensive lawyer she could find. Linda's plan was simple, or so she thought. She was going to sue the HOA for gross negligence, the developer for fraud, and me, Mr. Henderson, for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She wanted to prove that even if her house was built on a water main, it was everyone's fault but hers. She wanted a settlement that would pay for her relocation, and more importantly, she wanted my head on a metaphorical silver platter. The following Monday, while I was sitting on my porch enjoying the view of my untouched redwood fence, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. A man in a cheap suit hopped out and handed me a thick stack of papers. A subpoena. Linda was officially coming for me. But what Linda didn't realize was that when you spend 30 years as a senior clerk in the Land Records Office, you don't just learn where the maps are. You learn how the system breathes. You learn that for every lawsuit, there is a counter-audit. And I had been doing my homework while she was busy crying to her lawyer. The board meeting that followed was the stuff of legends. Because Linda was still technically the owner of Lot 42, even if she couldn't live in the house, she tried to force an emergency session. She walked in with her attorney, a man named Marcus who looked like he chewed through titanium for breakfast. "My client has been subjected to a coordinated campaign of harassment," Marcus announced to the remaining board members. "The information leaked by Mr. Henderson regarding the 1974 survey was confidential, misinterpreted, and used to cause irreparable harm to Ms. Miller's property value. We are demanding an immediate reinstatement of her presidency and a formal apology, or we will bankrupt this association in court." The other board members looked terrified. They were just regular neighbors, not legal experts. They looked at me, hoping I had one last trick up my sleeve. I stood up not from a seat of anger, but from a seat of absolute boredom. "Marcus, is it?" I asked, looking at the lawyer. "Before you file that suit, you might want to look at Exhibit G in the folder I just handed to Arthur, the vice president." Arthur pulled out a single, laminated sheet of paper. It wasn't a map this time. It was a copy of Linda's original HOA application and her property disclosure form from when she bought the house 3 months ago. "You see," I continued, my voice calm and steady, "when Linda applied for the HOA presidency, she signed an affidavit stating that she had performed all due diligence regarding the property's title and encumbrances. But more importantly, I found a record from the 2005 developer's audit, the one she claimed didn't exist." I walked up to the table and pointed to a signature at the bottom of a specific page. "This is a notice of easement awareness." It was signed by the original buyer in 2005. But look at the secondary signature for the title verification clerk who approved the transfer to Linda 3 months ago. The lawyer, Marcus, leaned in. His eyes widened. He looked at the signature, then at Linda, then back at the paper. "Linda," I said, turning to her, "you didn't just move here by accident. You worked for the title company that handled the 2005 developer's audit 5 years ago. You knew about the water main. You knew the house was encroaching. You thought that if you became the HOA president, you could rewrite the bylaws, hide the records, and eventually force the city to vacate the easement so you could sell the house for a massive profit." The room went silent. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was fraud. You used your position as a title clerk to hide a federal easement, then moved into the property yourself to clean the title as president, I explained to the stunned board. That's not just an HOA violation, Linda. That's insurance fraud, bank fraud, and a violation of the State Real Estate Disclosure Act. Linda's lawyer slowly closed his briefcase. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at Linda. He just stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the room. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and Linda wasn't just sinking. She was already at the bottom of the ocean. Linda sat there, her mouth hanging open. The Queen wasn't just losing her house now. She was looking at potential jail time. She had tried to sue me to keep her secret buried, but all she did was give me a legal platform to expose her entire scheme. I leaned over the table, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. You should have just left my fence alone, Linda. Now, instead of a 3-inch height violation, you're looking at a 3 to 5 year sentence. I walked out of that meeting, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the hallway. The legal battle hadn't even started, and it was already over. But the best part? The city's demolition crew was scheduled to return the next morning to start clearing the encroachment. And I had a front row seat. They say that a man's home is his castle, but when that castle is built on stolen ground, it's nothing more than a house of cards. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that whistled through the gaps of my redwood fence, the same fence that had started this entire war. But today, the neighborhood wasn't watching me. Every window in Oakwood Estates was pointed at Lot 42. Linda was there, standing on the sidewalk across from her own driveway. She wasn't wearing her power suit today. She was in a faded hoodie and jeans, clutching a cardboard box of the few belongings the city had allowed her to retrieve before the structure stabilization began. She looked smaller, somehow, stripped of the titles, the clipboard, and the unearned authority that had been her armor for months. The city hadn't wasted any time. Once the fraud was exposed and the safety inspector confirmed the risk to the water main, the legal gears turned with terrifying speed. Because the house sat on a critical infrastructure easement, the city didn't need a months-long court battle to act. They had emergency powers, and they were using them. The foreman mic gave the signal. The massive excavator groaned, its hydraulic hiss sounding like a beast waking up. The operator didn't go for the whole house, not yet. Their mission was surgical, remove the encroachment. But in a modern suburban home, removing the encroachment meant tearing out the entire 3-car garage and the master suite that sat directly above it. The first blow hit the corner of the garage. I watched as the autumn sienna trim, the same color Linda had called an eyesore on my property, was crushed into splinters and dust. There is a specific sound when a house dies. It's not just a crash, it's a groan of tension being released, the snapping of support beams that were never meant to be moved. As the second floor began to sag, the crowd of neighbors grew. Mrs. Gable was there, holding a thermos of tea. The Millers were standing right at the edge of the yellow caution tape, their faces a mix of shock and a very human sense of "I told you so." No one cheered. It was too heavy for that, but no one looked away either. Linda let out a jagged, broken sob as the excavator pulled a massive chunk of the master bedroom wall away. Through the gaping hole, we could see the interior, the expensive wallpaper she had bragged about, the designer curtains that met every HOA standard, and a lone bedside lamp that fell and shattered on the driveway below. "Stop it," she suddenly screamed, charging toward the caution tape. "That's my house, you're destroying my life." A police officer who was there to secure the site stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, stay back. This is a restricted demolition zone. You were served the emergency order 48 hours ago." "I'll sue," she yelled, her face contorted with the same rage she had used on me. "I'll sue every single one of you." The officer didn't even flinch. "With all due respect, ma'am, the county is already filing a lien against your remaining assets to pay for this demolition and the subsequent pipe reinforcement. You might want to save your breath for the DA." I walked down to the edge of my lawn, just a few feet away from where she was standing. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched the dust settle on the hood of her SUV. Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet enough that only she could hear it over the roar of the machinery. "You know, Linda," I said, "if you had just let me keep my 3 inches of wood, I never would have gone into my basement. I never would have looked at those old maps. You could have lived in that house for 30 years and no one would have ever known about the easement." She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a level of hatred that would have burned a hole through wood. "You did this," she hissed. "You ruined me over a fence." "No," I replied, pointing to the excavator as it took another massive bite out of her garage. "You ruined yourself over a clipboard. You were so busy looking for mistakes in everyone else's life that you forgot to hide the ones in yours." By noon, the front half of the house was a hollowed-out shell. The city crews were already bringing in the shoring beams to protect the water main before they started the deep excavation. Linda didn't stay to see the end. She got into her car, her cardboard box of memories in the passenger seat, and drove away. She didn't look back at the neighborhood she had tried to rule. But as I walked back to my porch, I noticed something. The HOA Vice President, Arthur, was standing by my fence. He was looking at the wood, then at the autumn sienna stain, and then at me. "Nice fence, Henderson," he said, nodding slowly. "It's a bit high, isn't it?" I froze for a second, but then Arthur winked. "But I think the neighborhood could use a little more height these days, keeps the wrong people out." The war was over. The Queen was gone. But as I sat down in my rocking chair, I knew there was still one more part to this story, because Linda might have been gone, but the file I had created wasn't just about her. It was about the developer who had sold these houses in the first place. And my next letter wasn't going to the HOA, it was going to the Attorney General. Linda was gone, her house was a hollowed-out carcass, and the HOA was in a state of shock. But as the dust settled over Lot 42, a new and more terrifying question began to circulate through the streets of Oakwood Estates. If Linda's house was built on a city water main, what about everyone else? You see, a developer doesn't just make a mistake on one lot. Development is a game of templates. If the foundation of one house was illegally poured over an easement, it meant the entire infrastructure plan for our community was a lie. And as a man who had spent 30 years staring at the DNA of land records, I couldn't just sit on my porch and let the rest of my neighbors live in houses that might be legal time bombs. I went back to the archives, not the digital ones, those are too easy to scrub. I went to the deep storage in the county basement, where the wet ink blueprints from the early 90s were kept. I was looking for the name Highland Development Group and their lead engineer, a man named Sterling Vance. What I found was chilling. As I cross-referenced the 1974 federal survey with the 1992 Highland site plan, the pattern emerged. It wasn't just Linda's lot. The developer had shifted the entire northern grid of Oakwood Estates by exactly 15 feet to the east. Why? To squeeze in 3 extra premium corner lots that shouldn't have existed. In the world of real estate development, 15 feet is a lifetime. By shifting that grid, Sterling Vance had saved the company millions in land costs, but he had placed 12 houses, including mine and Mrs. Gable's, partially onto protected city wetlands and utility corridors. I wasn't just fighting for my fence anymore. I was fighting to stop 12 families from losing everything. On Monday morning, I didn't go to the HOA board. I went to the mayor's office. I didn't ask for a meeting. I walked in with the 1992 blueprints and the notice of fraud I had drafted. I told the secretary, "Tell the city attorney that if he doesn't see me in the next 5 minutes, the local news is going to have a field day with why the city approved these permits 30 years ago." I was in the office in 3 minutes. "Mr. Henderson," the city attorney, a sharp man named David, said as he looked at my maps. "This is ancient history. Highland Development went bankrupt in 2008. There's no one to sue." "I'm not looking to sue a ghost, David," I said, leaning over his mahogany desk. "I'm looking for a covenant of indemnification. If the city admits they failed to verify the 1992 survey, you can issue a quiet title for the remaining residents. You can vacate the minor easements that aren't critical, like the ones under the wetlands, and save these families from the same fate as Linda." "And if I don't," he asked, testing me, "then I'll release the records showing that the city inspector in 1994 took a $50,000 consultation fee from Sterling Vance to sign off on these foundations," I replied, sliding a yellowed bank ledger across the desk. I had found it in my father's old files. My father hadn't just been a surveyor. He had been a whistleblower who was silenced before he could speak. David's face went white. He realized that this retired clerk hadn't just brought a map. I had brought the receipts of a 30-year-old crime. By that afternoon, the city was in damage control mode, but I wasn't done. I went back to the neighborhood and called an emergency town hall meeting, not at the community center but on my front lawn. I wanted everyone to see my redwood fence, the boundary that Linda had hated so much. "Listen to me," I shouted to the 40 neighbors gathered on my grass. "The city is going to try to tell you that everything is fine. They're going to try to offer you title insurance settlements. Do not sign them. We are filing a class action not against the bankrupt developer, but against the city's insurance bond for the 1994 negligence." The crowd was buzzing. For the first time, we weren't fighting each other over grass height or paint colors. We were a united front against the very system that had lied to us. But then a black car pulled up. Not a city car, a sleek modern sedan. A man stepped out, well-dressed, silver hair, and a smile that looked like it cost more than my house. It was Sterling Vance's son, Julian Vance, the CEO of the new Vance Global Holdings. "Mr. Henderson," Julian said, walking into the middle of my lawn like he owned it. "I heard you've been digging up the past. My father always said you were a stubborn man, but let's be reasonable. I'm prepared to offer a private settlement to every homeowner on this block, on one condition." The neighbors went silent. Julian looked at me, then at the fence. "You stop this investigation, you burn those 1992 files, and you move out of Oakwood Estates." I looked at my neighbors. I saw the fear in their eyes, the fear of a long legal battle. Then I looked at the man whose father had built our lives on a foundation of lies. "Julian," I said, stepping forward, "you've spent your whole life building on top of other people's mistakes, but you forgot one thing about this neighborhood. We're not just residents anymore, we're witnesses. And your settlement isn't an offer, it's a confession." I turned back to the crowd. "Who's with me?" One by one, the hands went up. Mrs. Gable, the Millers, even Arthur, the vice president. We weren't just an HOA anymore. We were a wall. As Julian Vance drove away, his tires screeching, I knew that Part 8 wasn't going to be about a fence. It was going to be about the biggest legal showdown in the history of the county. The Queen was dead, but the King was finally in our sights. Yaraha Opki story ka final Part 8. Ismin hum tamem threads ko bandhin. Linda ka angem, developer kai har or Opki, Redwood fence ka mukadar. Part emotional or satisfying don o hoga tak viewer retention end tak barkarar ra. They say the wheels of justice grind slowly, but when they finally reach full speed, they can crush anything in their path. The trial of the residents of Oakwood Estates versus Vance Global Holdings wasn't just a court case. It was the final stand of a community that had been lied to for 30 years. Julian Vance thought he could buy our silence with a settlement that wouldn't have even covered the cost of our foundation repairs. He underestimated the power of a man who spent his life in the land records office. In court, I didn't give a grand speech. I did what I do best. I presented the maps. When the judge saw the original 1974 federal survey, the one my father had signed with his own hand, and compared it to the fraudulent 1992 site plan, the room went silent. The evidence was undeniable. The shifting of the grid, the illegal building over city easements, and the consultation fees paid to city inspectors were all there in black and white. The verdict didn't just give us the quiet title we needed. The judge ordered Vance Global Holdings to pay for the complete structural stabilization of every affected home and a $20 million punitive damage award to the neighborhood. But more importantly, the city was forced to officially vacate all non-critical easements. For the first time in 3 decades, our homes truly belonged to us. But what about Linda? The Queen of Oakwood didn't go out with a bang. She went out with a whimper. After the fraud was exposed, the title insurance company she worked for filed their own lawsuit against her. She lost her license, her savings were drained by legal fees, and she was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. The last time I saw her, she wasn't wearing a power suit or carrying a clipboard. She was in a neon orange vest, picking up trash along the very highway that leads to our suburb. I was driving past in my old truck when I saw her. I didn't honk, I didn't wave. I just looked at her, and for a second, she looked back. She didn't have that smirk anymore. She just looked tired. She had tried to steal a life she didn't earn, and now she was cleaning up the world she had tried to mess up. As for Oakwood Estates, the vibe has changed. We don't have an HOA president anymore. We have a community council. There are no more fines for the wrong shade of mulch or trash cans left out too long. We realize that a neighborhood isn't built on rules, it's built on people. Arthur, the former vice president, stopped by my house last Sunday. I was out front, giving my redwood fence a fresh coat of autumn sienna stain. "You know, Henderson," Arthur said, leaning against the wood. "I checked the new city-approved master plan yesterday. Technically, since the easement was vacated, this fence is now perfectly legal." I smiled, wiping a drop of stain from my thumb. It was always legal, Arthur. The maps just had to catch up to the truth. I looked down the street. The Millers were having a barbecue. Mrs. Gable was planting new flowers, and for the first time in a year there was no shadow of a clipboard hanging over our lawns. I thought about my wife and how much she would have loved the peace we finally found. I realized then that this whole war wasn't really about 3 inches of wood. It was about the principle of a man's territory. It was about the fact that if you let someone take an inch of your dignity, they'll eventually come for your whole life. I sat down in my rocking chair, the smell of fresh cedar and autumn sienna filling the air. My fence was 6 feet high, custom-built and solid as a rock. It kept the wind out and it kept my memories in. And as the sun set over Oakwood Estates, I knew one thing for certain. In this neighborhood, the only thing we measure now is the height of our children and the depth of our friendships. The queen is gone, the king is defeated, and my fence, well, it's not going anywhere. If you enjoyed watching this HOA President's empire crumble over a single property deed, hit like and subscribe for more epic legal revenge stories. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss the next time we turn a simple fence dispute into a total boardroom shutdown.